The sun hovered high above the village, casting a warm golden glow on the scene unfolding below. The air was alive with rhythm. Drums thumped steadily, women's ululations pierced the air, and children ran through the dusty paths in bursts of laughter. Bright fabrics hung from trees like banners, and every corner of the compound sparkled with color. This was not just any celebration, it was the grandest wedding the village had seen in years. Guests arrived from distant towns, dressed in their best attire, each trying to outshine the other. The scent of roasted meat and flowers mingled in the air, creating a festive haze that wrapped itself around everyone present. Inside a decorated hut, the bride sat silently while women fussed around her, adjusting her beaded jewelry and smoothing her shimmering gown. Her eyes darted nervously toward the doorway as the sounds of drums grew louder outside. Today she was the center of attention, the jewel of the village. Yet, beneath the flawless makeup and layers of fine cloth, her heart raced with a strange mix of excitement and unease. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself, but her hands betrayed her with a slight tremble. Outside, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Near the entrance of the wedding grounds, an old beggar had settled on the ground. His clothes were faded and torn, his walking stick leaning against his frail shoulder. He watched quietly, his face unreadable, as though he carried secrets the world had forgotten. Some guests turned away in disgust, others stared with curiosity. He didn't move, didn't speak, he simply waited. No one knew why he had chosen this day to appear, but something about his stillness sent a chill through the festive air. Who was this old man, and why was he there on this day of joy? The village sat nestled between rolling hills and stretches of red earth, a place where the rhythm of life was carried in the songs of birds at dawn and the beat of drums at night. At first glance, it looked like a place where everyone shared the same sun, the same soil, and the same air. But beneath the surface lay a quiet divide. At the center were the wealthy families, those who owned fertile lands, bustling shops, and large compounds with high walls and carved wooden gates. They dressed in imported fabrics, wore gold and beads that gleamed under the sun, and held power in community decisions. On the edges of the village lived those who worked the fields, fetched water, and sold their goods in the market stalls. Their homes were smaller, their clothes worn thin, their voices rarely heard at village councils. This division had existed for generations, shaping relationships, marriages, and even celebrations. Among the wealthiest was the family of the bride. Her father was a well-known merchant who traded in spices, fabrics, and livestock, traveling between towns to build his fortune. His compound was the largest in the village, with a grand courtyard paved with stones, mango trees lining the entrance, and guards at the gates. Her mother was equally influential, a woman whose presence commanded respect wherever she went. She managed the family's affairs with precision, ensuring their name remained untarnished and their influence unquestioned. Together they were not just a family, they were a symbol of status and authority. The bride had grown up surrounded by abundance. From a young age, she was clothed in the finest garments, tutored by private teachers, and shielded from the struggles outside the compound walls. Her every need was met before she could even express it. Servants tended to her, elders praised her, and her parents ensured that nothing ever stained their image of perfection. Yet behind the golden curtain of luxury, there was a kind of distance. Her parents loved her, but their love often came in the form of expectations rather than warm embraces. She was taught to smile when guests arrived, to sit with grace, to speak only when spoken to, and to remember that she carried the family's reputation on her shoulders. Her laughter was polite, her steps carefully measured, her future planned without her voice ever being truly heard. This wedding was the pinnacle of those plans. It was not merely a union between two people, it was a grand performance, a display of power that would echo through the village for years. Hundreds of guests were invited. Wealthy traders, distant relatives of noble bloodlines, influential elders, and even government officials from nearby towns. White canopies stretched across the compound, musicians rehearsed tirelessly, and cooks worked day and night to prepare feasts that would feed an army. Every decoration, from the garlands of flowers to the patterned mats laid out for the guests, was chosen to impress. This was the kind of wedding that would be talked about for generations. The groom's family matched the bride's family in wealth and influence. They were known for their cattle business, owning herds that grazed across vast plains. Their wealth came not only from livestock but also from political connections. Their sons were educated abroad, their daughters adorned with jewels at every ceremony. The groom himself had returned from studying in the city, his manner polished, his reputation spotless. To the villagers, this marriage was like a royal union, a merging of two great houses that would strengthen their social standing and tighten their grip on influence within the region. Guests began arriving early, their laughter filling the air as they exchanged greetings. Colorful fabrics shimmered under the sun, and every corner of the village buzzed with anticipation. Even those from the poorer outskirts came to watch from afar, standing outside the compound walls just to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. It wasn't every day that such grandeur visited their village. Amid the glamour and movement, the elderly beggar remained at his usual spot near the outer gate. His presence was like a shadow against the bright walls, silent and unbothered. He leaned on his walking stick, his face calm, his eyes observing everything with quiet attentiveness. People walked past him without acknowledgement, as if he were part of the dust on the ground. A few children whispered and pointed, but their parents quickly hushed them, warning them not to disturb the useless old man. Yet he watched, not with bitterness, but with a strange familiarity, as though he understood the stories behind the polished gates better than anyone else. He saw the guests arrive, the laughter, the pride, and the careful performances. And while the crowd celebrated wealth and status, his presence lingered like a silent question waiting to be answered. Inside the beautifully decorated hut where she was preparing, the bride's reflection stared back at her from a polished brass mirror. Her face was flawless, her hair arranged in intricate braids adorned with delicate beads, her gown shining like the morning sun. To everyone else she looked like the perfect bride, a picture of joy and elegance. But behind that carefully crafted smile, her heart trembled with a storm she couldn't share with anyone. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers tightening around each other as if holding on to something invisible. The songs and laughter outside seemed distant, as though she was sitting in a quiet pocket of time while the world spun around her. She had always known this day would come, but she had imagined it differently when she was younger. She had dreamed of falling in love with someone who would see her as more than a symbol of her family's status. She wanted to choose, to feel a sense of belonging that was hers alone. But as she grew, she realized that in her world, choices were luxuries reserved for the powerful, and even she, the treasured daughter, was more of a vessel for her parents' ambitions than a navigator of her destiny. Her parents never asked her if she wanted to marry the groom. They only told her that the arrangement was perfect. His wealth matched theirs, his reputation was spotless, and together they would become the most influential family in the region. She was expected to nod, smile, and obey. Memories of those conversations came rushing back. She remembered sitting at the dinner table when her father announced the engagement. Her voice had been small as she asked if she would get to know him first, but her mother's cold, sharp look silenced her instantly. "This is not about feelings," her father had said with a proud smile. "This is about family, legacy, and respect." She had swallowed her words that night, staring at the untouched food on her plate. There were other times too, when she asked to pursue her own interests, when she wanted to study outside the village, when she suggested inviting her childhood friends to the ceremony. Each time, her ideas were brushed aside like crumbs on a polished table. The decisions were made for her, she simply lived within them. Just a few days before the wedding, something unusual happened. She had walked out alone in the early evening to clear her thoughts, her veil trailing behind her in the dusty path. That was when she saw the elderly beggar sitting near the market square. His presence was familiar. She had seen him many times before, though never this closely. On impulse she approached him. He looked up slowly, his eyes deep and knowing, carrying a weight that startled her. She hesitated at first, unsure why she had come, but then she offered him a small bundle of food she had carried from home. He accepted it with a gentle nod, his hands trembling slightly. Before she could leave he spoke, his voice soft yet piercing. "The richest weddings build the tallest walls," he said, looking at the horizon. "But walls don't protect hearts, they only hide their silence." His words hung in the air like a riddle, but something about them struck her deeply. She stood there for a moment, unable to respond. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not her parents, not her friends, not even the groom. She walked back home with his words echoing in her mind, unsure why they unsettled her so much. Now, on the morning of her wedding, those same words returned to her like a whisper. As she sat surrounded by luxury, her heart carried the weight of doubts she couldn't voice. Was this marriage truly hers, or was she merely a beautiful piece in a game played by others? Her smile remained fixed, but inside she felt as though she was standing at the edge of a vast, silent wall, uncertain of what lay beyond. "You said." Every morning, long before the village stirred to life, the elderly beggar began his quiet routine. He lived at the edge of the settlement in a small, crumbling mud hut that most people believed was abandoned. At dawn, when the first light kissed the hills, he would step out slowly, leaning on his carved wooden stick. His clothes were patched and faded, his sandals worn thin, yet his movements carried a strange grace, as though his body remembered a time when he walked with purpose. He would make his way to the village paths, sitting beneath the shade of a large baobab tree near the market square. From there he observed the day unfold, the traders setting up their stalls, children chasing one another through the dust, women balancing baskets on their heads and men discussing their crops and cattle. To most villagers he was simply the old beggar. People passed him daily without so much as a glance. Some children, emboldened by their friends, would laugh at him or mimic his slow shuffle. Teenagers threw pebbles at the ground near his feet to see if he would react. He rarely did. A few adults would drop coins or leftover food in his hands, not out of compassion but to ease their conscience. Others ignored him entirely, as if his existence was a stain on the bright image of their prosperous community. Through all of this he remained calm. His gaze was steady, his voice soft when he spoke and his manner humble. There was no bitterness in his silence, only the quiet patience of someone who saw life differently from those around him. But there were moments, small, almost invisible, that hinted at something deeper. On several occasions, lost children who had wandered away from home were found safely sitting beside him under the tree. When a neighbor's goat broke its leg, he fashioned a splint with such practiced skill that the animal recovered fully within weeks. When the market fell silent at midday, sometimes a few elders would sit with him, and he would speak in short, thoughtful phrases that sounded more like riddles than advice. "A river forgets the stone it carries," he once said to a grieving woman, and somehow, those words brought her peace. People brushed these moments aside, explaining them away as coincidences or the strange ramblings of age. But those who listened closely knew there was something unusual about him. Years ago, before the young people of the village were even born, his name had been spoken with respect. He had been a healer, a man who knew herbs and remedies that cured both wounds and spirits. Some said he had also been a soldier in his youth, a brave protector during turbulent times, though the stories varied with every retelling. He had left the village suddenly and mysteriously. No one knew why. Some whispered that betrayal had driven him away, others believed he had lost everything to a personal tragedy. Over the years, his memory faded from the minds of the new generation, replaced by the image of a frail beggar sitting under a tree. Only a few of the oldest villagers recognized his eyes when they passed him, but even they remained silent, unsure of the truth that lay behind his fall from grace. He had returned quietly one rainy season, appearing one morning near the marketplace without fanfare. He did not speak of where he had been, nor did he ask for help. He simply settled into his new life of quiet observation. Some villagers speculated that he had gone mad or lost his fortune elsewhere. Others said he had chosen a life of humility to atone for past sins. But he never offered explanations. Instead, he seemed content to live in the spaces between other people's stories, unnoticed yet ever present. On the morning of the wedding, as drums echoed through the village and guests bustled through the streets in bright clothing, the beggar walked his usual path. But this time something in the air unsettled him. He paused often, looking around with a furrowed brow, as if listening to something no one else could hear. He watched the workers stringing decorations and the cooks preparing feasts, but his attention lingered on the gates of the bride's family compound. A quiet heaviness sat in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. His instincts, honed from a lifetime of observing people and sensing danger, whispered to him that this day was not as it appeared. As he reached his usual spot by the outer gate, he sat slowly, resting his stick across his knees. His eyes scanned the crowd, studying faces with a depth that made passers-by uneasy if they happened to catch his gaze. He wasn't looking for celebration, he was searching for shadows. He could feel the tremor of something approaching, like a storm building beyond the horizon. The laughter, the music, and the glamour of the wedding only seemed to make that feeling sharper. He didn't know exactly what would happen, but his heart told him that before the day ended, the village would remember him, not as the beggar they ignored, but as someone they had once forgotten. "You said 800. The sun had climbed higher by the time the wedding ceremony began, spilling golden light across the village and turning the decorations into a dazzling sea of colors. Drums thundered in rhythmic patterns, their deep tones vibrating through the ground and into the chests of everyone gathered. Women sang traditional songs, their voices rising and falling like waves, filling the air with a sense of both joy and reverence. Guests continued to pour in from every direction, wrapped in their most brilliant attire, reds, blues, golds, and greens blending like a living tapestry. The scent of roasted meat, spices and fresh flowers drifted through the compound, mingling with the sound of laughter and celebration. Every corner was alive, every face eager to witness what many believed would be the most memorable union in years. At the far end of the compound, the bride stood waiting for her cue to walk. Her heart pounded beneath her gown as women around her adjusted her veil one last time. The drums shifted to a slower, ceremonial rhythm, and the singing softened. All eyes turned toward her. She stepped forward with deliberate grace, her gown shimmering as it caught the light. The path had been lined with petals and children scattered flowers before her as she walked, creating a royal walkway. Gasps of admiration rippled through the crowd. Whispers followed her like a breeze, praises for her beauty, envy at her attire, awe at the wealth and power on display. For a moment, the weight of doubt in her chest eased under the force of the spectacle surrounding her. The groom waited at the center of the courtyard, dressed in ceremonial robes that matched the grandeur of the event. His family stood proudly beside him, their expressions carefully arranged to reflect control and prestige. Yet if one looked closely, there were cracks in that composure. His father's eyes darted around more often than necessary, his mother's hands clasped tightly together as if to steady herself. The groom himself shifted uneasily, his smile holding a stiffness that didn't quite match the joy of the occasion. They exchanged polite glances with guests, but there was an unspoken tension hovering over them, subtle enough that only the most observant would notice. Near the entrance, seated in his usual quiet place, the elderly beggar watched everything unfold. The noise, the colors, the grand display, all of it passed through his gaze like a current over stone. His body remained still, but his eyes missed nothing. He followed the movements of servants rushing back and forth, the nervous glances of certain guests, and the patterns of strangers standing at the edges of the gathering. Unlike the others, he wasn't swept away by the celebration. He was listening for the silence between the drumbeats, watching for the shadows that hid in plain sight. Then, as the ceremony reached its midpoint, subtle signs of disturbance began to appear. It started with smoke, thin and gray, curling upward from behind one of the decorative tents near the edge of the compound. At first, people ignored it, assuming it was from the cooking fires. But the smoke grew darker, heavier, accompanied by the faint crackle of flames. A few servants rushed toward it, their hurried movements attracting attention. Murmurs spread through the crowd as guests turned their heads, fanning themselves nervously. At the same time, a group of men lingered near the perimeter. Their clothes were ordinary, their faces unfamiliar to many of the villagers. They didn't join in the singing or dancing. Instead, they stood close together, their eyes constantly shifting toward the bride and groom. One of them whispered something to another, and their subtle movements carried a kind of coordination that didn't fit with the carefree nature of wedding guests. The beggar's gaze fixed on them, narrowing slightly. He had seen this kind of watchfulness before, calculated, patient, waiting for the right moment. The groom's family noticed it too. His father leaned toward one of his brothers, whispering urgently. A messenger was sent to the guards at the gate, their presence suddenly more pronounced as they tightened their watch. The bride, walking slowly toward the groom, sensed the shift. The joyful singing no longer felt light, it carried a nervous undertone, like a song that had lost its rhythm. The beggar gripped his walking stick a little tighter. The smoke thickened behind the tent, rising into the clear sky, and the group of strangers began inching closer to the heart of the gathering. Guests tried to remain calm, convincing themselves it was nothing, but unease settled like a shadow over the celebration. Something was wrong. The beggar could feel it in his bones, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive through darker days. The wedding was no longer just a ceremony, it was the calm before a storm no one else seemed fully prepared to face. The moment of celebration shattered like glass. One of the servants screamed as flames suddenly leapt from the back of the tent, spreading along the fabric with terrifying speed. What had started as a small trail of smoke erupted into a wall of fire, crackling loudly as it devoured decorations and sent sparks flying into the sky. The music stopped abruptly, drums falling silent mid-beat. Guests turned toward the flames, their cheers replaced by gasps of fear. Within seconds, panic rippled through the courtyard like a wave. Children cried, women grabbed their belongings and fled, and men shouted over one another, unsure of what to do. Amid the chaos, the group of unfamiliar men at the perimeter sprang into action. Their movements were too coordinated to be chance. Two of them broke toward the bride, cutting through the scattering guests like wolves through a flock. One grabbed a piece of cloth from under his robe, revealing a blade that glinted sharply in the sunlight. Shouts of alarm rose. Someone yelled, "They're armed." That was enough to send a portion of the crowd into full-blown frenzy. People ran in every direction, trampling flowers and knocking over tables. The carefully arranged wedding suddenly turned into a chaotic battlefield. The bride froze for a heartbeat, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Her veil fluttered wildly in the sudden rush of bodies. The flames grew larger, casting an orange glow across the compound and choking the air with smoke. She turned to run toward her family, but one of the armed men cut off her path, stepping in front of her with a twisted grin. Another came from behind, trapping her between them. Her eyes widened in terror. Guests tried to intervene, but in the confusion, their efforts were clumsy. One man was struck down by the attacker's swift blow. Another tripped while trying to shield a child. The guards at the gate were momentarily distracted by the fire, unsure whether to fight the flames or chase the intruders. The groom's family shouted commands, but their voices were lost in the roar of fire and the cries of panicked guests. The groom himself tried to push through the crowd toward his bride, but the surge of fleeing people separated them. The bride's father bellowed orders to his men, but his authority, so strong in calm times, faltered in the face of sudden danger. The attackers moved with precision. One grabbed the bride's wrist, yanking her toward the gate. She stumbled, crying out as her jeweled sandals scraped against the stones. Through it all, the elderly beggar sat watching, his eyes sharp and calculating. He had sensed this. The unease he'd felt earlier now unfolded before him like a scene he had witnessed long ago. Slowly he rose to his feet, leaning on his stick. To those still nearby, he looked like an old man standing against a storm far too big for him. But there was something different in his posture now. The weight of age seemed to lift from his shoulders. His gaze locked onto the attackers, and a faint flicker of recognition passed through his expression, not of them specifically but of their kind. He had seen violence before. He knew its rhythm. As the men dragged the bride closer to the edge of the compound, the beggar moved. He slipped through the chaos with surprising agility, using the fleeing crowd to cover his approach. One of the attackers noticed him and sneered, swinging his blade to scare him off. But instead of retreating, the beggar raised his stick and struck with startling speed. The blow landed on the man's wrist with surgical precision, forcing him to drop the weapon. Before the attacker could recover, the beggar pivoted and delivered a second strike to his knee, sending him sprawling to the ground. Gasps erupted from those who saw it. No one had expected such swiftness from someone they dismissed for years. The second attacker tried to pull the bride toward the gate, but the beggar was already there, blocking his path. He spoke no words, only moved with a quiet, focused determination. When the man lunged, the beggar sidestepped and hooked his walking stick behind the man's ankle, sending him crashing backward. The bride stumbled, but the beggar caught her arm before she fell. His grip was firm, steady, protective. He led her swiftly toward the side of the compound, navigating through smoke and frightened guests with uncanny knowledge of the grounds. Instead of heading toward the main gate, he guided her to a narrow passage behind the kitchen area, a forgotten servant's path that only long-time residents would know. "This way," he said calmly, his voice cutting through her panic like a steady drumbeat. She followed, coughing from the smoke but trusting the strange confidence in his eyes. They slipped through the narrow corridor as the attackers regrouped and the crowd finally began to fight back. The guards, realizing what was happening, rushed to intercept the remaining intruders. By the time the attackers reached the passage, the beggar and the bride had already emerged on the far side, hidden behind a stack of clay pots. From there he scanned the scene quickly. The fire was being tackled by villagers with buckets of water, the groom's family was organizing defenses, and the attackers were being cornered. The beggar placed himself between the bride and the open space, ready to face anyone who came through. Finally the chaos began to subside. 2 attackers were captured, the others fled into the hills. The flames were slowly brought under control, leaving behind charred fabric and smoke-filled air. Guests who had once ignored the old man now stared at him in disbelief. His movements had been too sharp, too deliberate for a frail beggar. The bride clung to his arm, trembling but safe. For the first time, the villagers saw him not as a silent shadow but as a figure standing tall, his presence commanding without a single boast. The beggar exhaled slowly, his heart steady despite the storm he had just faced. In that moment he was no longer invisible. He was the unexpected hero of the day. "You said." The smoke slowly thinned as the flames were finally beaten down. The drums that had once filled the air with rhythm now lay silent, blackened by ash. Guests who had fled moments earlier began trickling back, their faces marked by shock and disbelief. The once joyous wedding ground now looked like a battlefield, scattered chairs, overturned tables, broken decorations and smoldering fabric. Yet amid the ruin, one thing stood clear: the bride was safe, and the old beggar stood at the center of it all like a pillar in a storm that had passed. The bride clung to her torn veil, her breath still uneven from the chaos. Her eyes remained fixed on the elderly man beside her. Just minutes ago he had moved like someone decades younger, precise, fearless, calm. Now he stood quietly, leaning again on his stick as if the burst of strength had never happened. Around them murmurs grew louder. "Who is he?" someone whispered. "That old beggar. Did you see what he did?" another replied. "He fought like a soldier." The groom's family approached cautiously, their fine clothes dirted by smoke. The bride's father came forward next, his usual authoritative posture softened by genuine awe. He looked the old man up and down, his mind struggling to fit this courageous figure into the image of the beggar he'd ignored for years. Villagers began to gather around in a loose circle, whispering among themselves. Some squinted as if trying to recognize a face they hadn't truly looked at in decades. Others exchanged theories in hushed voices. One elderly woman gasped suddenly, her wrinkled hand flying to her mouth. "It can't be," she murmured. The village elder, a man with a slow but commanding presence, stepped forward from the crowd. His gaze was sharp, and when it fell upon the beggar, something in his expression shifted: recognition, disbelief, and respect all at once. "Remove his hood," the elder said softly. One of the groom's brothers gently pulled back the beggar's hood. The light revealed his face more clearly than it had been seen in years. His features were aged but strong, his eyes steady, his jawline familiar to those old enough to remember the man he once was. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a gust of wind through tall grass. "It's him," someone said. "Yes, Kofi Mensah," another whispered. "The war hero, the landowner who disappeared." The elder nodded slowly. "Indeed," he said aloud for all to hear. "Kofi Mensah. Once the bravest soldier of this village, who fought to protect our lands when raiders came. The man who gave up everything, his wealth, his family, his name, to protect others. We thought he was dead, but he returned silently, living among us as a beggar, unseen." The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderclap. People began recalling stories told long ago, of a man betrayed by his business partners, of land seized while he was away defending the borders, of a noble figure who vanished rather than bring war upon his village. And all this time he had walked among them in rags. The bride's eyes widened. Memories flashed, a moment from her childhood, when she was lost in the forest during a festival. A gentle man with kind eyes had found her and led her back safely, disappearing before anyone could thank him. "It's you," she whispered, stepping closer. "You're the man who saved me when I was little." The beggar, "No, Kofi," turned to her with a faint smile. "And today you returned that kindness," he said softly. "You gave me food when no one else would." Then the bride's father froze as another realization struck him. "Kofi, my wife's father?" His voice trembled. "Are you?" Kofi nodded. "Yes. Before she married you, she was my daughter. I left to protect her from the chaos of my downfall. I never returned, for fear of bringing that danger upon her." The crowd erupted into gasps and cries. The bride covered her mouth, overwhelmed. The man who had saved her life today wasn't a stranger at all. He was her grandfather, the forgotten protector of their lineage. The elder raised his hand to silence the crowd. "Today," he said solemnly, "a forgotten hero has returned to us. Not in riches but in courage. And we who once ignored him now see him for who he truly is." The villagers bowed their heads in respect. The bride stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and gently took Kofi's weathered hands in hers. The wedding might have been scarred by chaos, but a deeper truth had been revealed, one that would bind the community together far more powerfully than any ceremony. "You said, Purple Circle 8. The chatter slowly died down as the crowd gathered more tightly around the old man, their faces lit by the soft, flickering glow of the remaining lanterns. The chaos had passed, but something far more powerful now filled the air, a heavy, expectant silence. All eyes were fixed on the elderly beggar, no longer just a frail old man, but a figure draped in mystery and reverence. The bride stood closest to him, her hands still holding his as if afraid that letting go might make the moment disappear. The village elder gave a gentle nod. "Tell them," he said. "Tell them your truth. They must hear it from you." Kofi took a deep breath, the kind that seemed to pull memories from the deepest corners of his soul. His voice, though aged, carried the strength of a man who had endured storms few could imagine. "Many years ago," he began slowly, I was not the man you see before you. I was a husband, a father, a landowner. I walked through this village not in rags but with pride. My farm stretched far beyond those hills, my house was filled with laughter, and my family was my heart. A ripple of recognition passed through the older villagers. Some had indeed heard tales of a prosperous man who lived on the outskirts long ago. But wealth, Kofi continued, has a way of drawing both friends and snakes. I trusted men who wore smiles but held daggers behind their backs. While I was away defending the borders during the raids, those men forged papers, seized my lands and spread lies. When I returned, I found betrayal where loyalty should have been. He paused, his eyes glistening but steady. I fought to reclaim what was mine, but my enemies were powerful, well-connected. And in the midst of that storm, my wife fell ill. I sold what little I had left to get her medicine, but it was too late. She died in my arms. My daughter, your mother, he said, looking toward the bride's father and then the bride, was taken in by a distant relative in the village. I wanted to stay, but my presence brought threats. So I left. I left everything. The bride's father looked shaken. His usual commanding posture had crumbled. All these years, he whispered. All this time you were alive. I was, Kofi replied gently. But not as the man you remembered. I wandered for years seeking peace. I wore the clothes of the poor not because I was defeated, but because I chose humility over pride. I watched from the edges of the world I once ruled. And when I finally returned here, I returned not to reclaim riches, but to watch over the last piece of my heart, her. He gestured toward the bride. The bride's mother stepped forward, tears streaking down her painted cheeks. Her voice trembled. When I married into this family, she confessed, my father, your enemies, convinced me that aligning with wealth and power was the only way to secure my future. I turned away from you, from my own blood, because I was ashamed of what people said. And when you disappeared, I believed the lie that you had died. Her knees weakened and she sank to the ground in front of him, sobbing. Kofi knelt slowly beside her, his movements deliberate and kind. I never hated you, he said softly. I understood the world's cruelty. I only hoped one day you would see through it. The bride's father stood frozen, guilt etched deeply on his face. All these years, he said in a broken voice, I mocked you. I called you worthless. I forbade anyone to feed you near our house. I did not know you were the very man who gave us everything we have today. He lowered his head in shame. Kofi turned toward him, his gaze neither harsh nor forgiving, simply true. The world has a way of turning kings into beggars and beggars into protectors, he said. I did not return for vengeance. I returned because she, pointing to the bride, is the future of this family. I watched her grow. I was there when she took her first steps in the village square. When she got lost as a child, I found her and returned her safely. I have always been here in the shadows, ensuring she would not face the dangers that once destroyed us. The bride's eyes overflowed with tears. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. Kofi smiled faintly. Because some truths must wait for the right moment. And today, the moment found us. The crowd stood in absolute silence. Some villagers covered their mouths, others wiped tears from their cheeks. What had started as a glamorous wedding had turned into something far deeper, a reckoning with the past, a confession of guilt, and a moment of healing that no one had expected. The village elder finally spoke, his voice filled with reverence. Today the masks have fallen. Pride has met truth and truth has prevailed. Kofi looked around at the faces that once ignored him, and for the first time in years he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt seen. The bride held his hand tighter, her heart swelling with love for a man who had silently guarded her life. The wedding was no longer just a union of two wealthy families, it had become the binding of generations, the stitching together of what had been torn apart. In that sacred silence, beneath the stars that now shone over the recovering village, everyone knew they had witnessed something greater than celebration. They had witnessed truth revealed. The bride took a deep breath, her veil still torn at the edges, her gown slightly marked by soot and dust, yet her presence radiated a strength and grace that had not been there before. She turned to face the crowd, then slowly stepped toward Kofi. The murmurs faded into silence as everyone watched. With steady hands she lifted his worn walking stick, placed it gently to the side, and then knelt before him, bowing her head in respect. A collective gasp swept through the guests. It was unheard of for a bride from such a powerful family to kneel publicly before anyone, let alone a man they had once considered a beggar. Her voice, soft but clear, carried through the quiet night. All my life I was taught to honor wealth, status and appearances, she said. But today I have learned the true meaning of honor. This man stood in the shadows to protect me, even when we turned our backs on him. He saved my life not just today but long before I even knew it. She rose to her feet and gently placed her hands on his shoulders, looking into his eyes. "Grandfather," she whispered with tears glistening, "today I give you back the respect this family should have never taken away." The groom's family and the bride's parents stepped forward together. The father, still shaken but humbled, embraced Kofi tightly, his voice breaking. "Forgive me," he whispered. The mother joined, her tears soaking his tattered robe. For the first time in decades, the family stood united, no longer divided by pride or status. The villagers erupted in cheers, clapping and chanting his name. Some came forward to bow, others simply smiled through tears. The musicians picked up their drums again, but this time the rhythm was different. Lighter, joyful, sincere. The decorations were no longer perfect, but the atmosphere was filled with something far more powerful than luxury: genuine love and respect. As the wedding resumed, laughter and singing filled the air once more. The bride leaned close to Kofi and whispered so only he could hear, "Thank you, for never leaving me." He smiled softly, his eyes glimmering with pride and peace. He was no longer a forgotten man. He was family. He was home. As the night deepened, the village glowed softly beneath a blanket of stars. The wedding drums echoed through the warm air, no longer as a symbol of wealth or prestige, but as a rhythm of unity, truth, and healing. The people who once averted their eyes from the old beggar now looked toward him with reverence, their hearts changed by the night's revelations. The narrator's voice rose gently over the scene. Sometimes the most powerful protectors wear rags, not crowns. They walk among us quietly, unseen, carrying truths too heavy for ordinary hearts. But when the moment comes, their silence becomes the force that changes destinies. The camera panned upward, capturing the wide night sky above the celebrating village. A sky vast and eternal, witnessing generations rise, fall, and heal. Laughter mixed with the sound of drums, and families who once stood apart now danced together. In the end, the narrator continued, riches may build walls but only character builds bridges. And those who honor the unseen will find that true greatness often hides in the simplest of souls. The stars shimmered brighter, and the story closed not with grandeur but with truth.